behind locked gates and walls of glass, a world built on order and silence was about to be torn open by an act so unexpected it forced everyone inside to question what they believed about loyalty, power, and courage. Wealth and rules had hidden the cracks for years, but one desperate decision in a moment of crisis would turn the mansion's certainty into chaos and reveal that the person least noticed was the one who could rewrite everything. Stay with us, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you think of the story's twist. The new maid in the Mansion of Silence, Clarissa Jones had never set foot in a place so pristine, so intimidating, and so deeply unwelcoming as the Whitmore estate. From the very first morning she was brought through the iron gates and past the white pillared facade, she felt the air tighten around her chest, not because the house was suffocating in the literal sense, but because it carried an atmosphere that reminded her constantly she did not belong. The mansion itself was a fortress of glass and marble, perched high in the hills, where every surface gleamed under careful maintenance, and every sound seemed absorbed by carpets so thick they could silence even the heaviest of footsteps. This was a house designed to keep the world at bay, and more importantly, to keep its own stories locked inside. Clarissa had been hired only 3 days earlier, handed a mop, shown a narrow room with a single bed that barely fit in the corner, and expected to melt seamlessly into the background. Nobody asked who she was, why she had applied for the position, or why her hands carried the calluses and scars of someone who had worked far too many jobs for far too little pay. Nobody asked why she laced her shoes so tightly it looked as though she was always bracing for a long run. They did not care about her history, her dreams, or her reasons. They cared only that the floors shone and the rooms smelled faintly of lavender polish. Adrian Whitmore, the master of the estate, was a man whose empire spanned technology, finance, and investments across continents, but whose presence inside his own home felt more like a shadow than a father's embrace. He lived by schedules, transactions, and rules. His face was rarely seen by staff, and when it was, his eyes slid over them as though they were invisible. The mansion reflected him perfectly, controlled, efficient, sterile. The staff whispered that his world wasn't cold, it was temperature-controlled, and Clarissa believed them. Every door had sensors blinking above it, every corridor had cameras, and certain areas were marked by invisible boundaries none of the servants dared cross. At the far end of the upstairs hall was one such place, Adrian's private office. Clarissa had never been inside, but even from a distance, she noticed the subtle hum of machines, the faint tick of something behind the heavy wooden door, like time itself waiting to expire. Yet the strangest part of the estate was not the master, but his son. Daniel Whitmore, only 10 years old, was delicate and fragile, carrying the cruel burden of sickle cell disease. He spent most days secluded in the sunroom upstairs, cocooned in sweaters and silence, rarely speaking to the cooks, the drivers, or even his own father. His footsteps were shuffles, his laughter cracked quickly like old paint, and his presence lingered more like a ghost than a boy. The staff handled him with the same mechanical precision they handled the silverware. Food delivered on time, medication checked, curtains drawn to soften the light. But no one asked how he was really feeling. No one dared to look closer at the pain flickering in his small eyes. They treated his survival as another task on the household list, never pausing long enough to acknowledge the child within. Clarissa, despite being told not to ask questions, couldn't help but notice. On her third morning, she carried a tray with toast and juice to Daniel's room. She hesitated at the door, knocking softly, and when no answer came, she pushed it open. What she saw made her freeze. Daniel lay curled on the floor, his body folded into itself, his eyes open but distant, his breaths shallow and uneven. Clarissa did not cry out or panic. Instead, she set the tray down quietly and lowered herself to the carpet, crossing her legs beside him. For a long moment, she said nothing, did nothing, just matched her presence to his silence. Eventually, Daniel whispered, "It hurts today." His voice was so faint it might have been mistaken for wind. Clarissa simply nodded, no questions, no promises, just acknowledgement. In that tiny act, something shifted. Not in the household, not in the grand rhythm of the mansion, but in the fragile space between one boy and one maid. Downstairs, meanwhile, two older maids whispered over folded towels. "I give her a week," one said, smoothing the linens. "She's too soft for this place." The other chuckled, muttering, "She's got that look, like she's seen struggle. And struggle doesn't last long here." They laughed, their voices low, not realizing Clarissa was passing with arms full of pillowcases. She didn't answer them, but she heard every word. She carried their words with her like stones in her pocket, reminders of how invisible they all expected her to be, how quickly they believed the house would grind her down. That evening, Adrian returned from a trip abroad, his gray suit immaculate, his phone still pressed to his ear as he walked through the marble halls. Daniel did not greet him, and Adrian did not pause at his son's door. Their estrangement was not dramatic, not loud. It was a routine indifference, practiced so long it became habit. Clarissa, dusting the upstairs study, noticed the way Adrian's eyes barely glanced down the corridor toward the sunroom. She also noticed, again, the locked office at the end of the hall, the sensors blinking like watchful eyes. Something about that door unsettled her, though she couldn't yet explain why. The day ended as it always did, with silence pressing heavily against the walls. But Clarissa felt the tension growing beneath the surface. She was new, untested, and cautious, but she already sensed the cracks in the mansion's perfection. Daniel was more fragile than anyone admitted, Adrian more distant than anyone dared to confront, and the staff more devoted to procedure than to compassion. Clarissa tied her shoes tighter that night before bed, lying awake in the small servant's room, listening to the house hum with quiet machinery. She told herself she could endure, that she could survive in this place if she stayed unnoticed. The cooks prepared trays of food and set them on tables without waiting for him to eat. The nurse checked vitals with clinical efficiency before vanishing early, and the other maids dusted his room as if he were no different from the furniture. But Clarissa could not unsee what she saw, and that was where the bond began in noticing. On her fourth morning, she climbed the staircase with another breakfast tray, balancing toast and tea, and hesitated outside his room with her hand hovering near the door. She knocked twice and waited. No answer. The mansion seemed to hold his breath as she pushed the door open and found Daniel curled awkwardly on the floor, his face pressed against his knees, his lips pale, his body quivering as though every muscle fought against itself. The tray rattled in her hands until she set it carefully on the dresser, and then she lowered herself beside him, her knees folding under her, her eyes fixed on him with neither judgment nor pity. They sat in silence for a long time until Daniel whispered, "It hurts today." His voice was thin, almost weightless, and Clarissa simply nodded, the acknowledgement enough to bridge the gap between them. It was not a world-changing moment, but it was a beginning, a shift too soft to be heard by anyone else, yet strong enough to echo in her heart. Downstairs, the other maids continued their gossip, leaning over folded towels near the laundry chute. "I give her a week," one muttered. "She's too soft, can't last here." The other replied, "She's got that look, like she's seen real struggle. Struggle doesn't last long in this place." They chuckled without glancing up, but Clarissa passed silently behind them with arms full of pillowcases, her face expressionless, though their words pressed against her chest like weights. She heard them clearly, every syllable, but chose silence because she knew that speaking would change nothing. What mattered was upstairs, where a sick boy had trusted her enough to whisper his pain. That evening, golden lights spilled across the estate as Adrian Whitmore returned from another long day abroad. His footsteps were clipped, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression as unreadable as stone. He did not ask about Daniel. He did not even glance toward the sunroom where his son sat wrapped in silence. Clarissa, dusting the shelves in the upstairs study, noticed how his gaze lingered instead on the locked door at the end of the hall, the office sealed by sensors and secrets, a place off limits even to those who scrubbed the floors nearby. The blinking lights above that door seemed almost alive, a reminder that rules, not compassion, governed this household. Adrian continued past without pause, his indifference as practiced as his wealth. Daniel remained upstairs, silent as always. But when Clarissa returned with fresh sheets later that night, she found him lying on his bed with eyes open to the ceiling, as though staring into a world beyond the ornate chandelier. She approached slowly, unsure whether to speak, but his small hand twitched toward her in invitation. She sat down at the edge of the bed, folding the sheets neatly across her lap, and for the first time she asked softly, "Do you want me to stay?" He nodded once, barely moving his head, but that was enough. She stayed, humming faintly, not a song she remembered fully, just a rhythm from her childhood that soothed her as much as it seemed to soothe him. Minutes stretched into an hour, and the silence between them grew less heavy, more like a shared blanket than a wall. In those quiet hours, Clarissa realized the truth about this house. Daniel had everything money could buy except the one thing no one here seemed willing to give: attention that saw him as a child, not a responsibility. She thought of her own past, of nights spent alone with aching bones and no one to notice, and something inside her hardened. She could not fix the boy's illness, could not repair the distance between him and his father, but she could be present, and presence was the one gift she still had to give. It became their ritual over the next few days, small moments stolen between her duties and his fragile silences. She would deliver his meals, linger near his chair, listen when he whispered about the pain in his chest or the dizziness that sometimes blurred his vision. She did not speak much because words were often useless in the face of suffering, but her quiet nods, her steady eyes, and her simple presence built something stronger than any conversation. Daniel began to wait for her, his eyes lifting toward the door whenever her footsteps approached, and though he rarely smiled, when he did, it was directed at her. Downstairs, the staff noticed her absences, whispering louder now. "She's wasting her time," one said. "That boy doesn't need her. He's got doctors and nurses." Another shook her head. "She's going to get herself fired. Mr. Whitmore doesn't want staff making friends." But Clarissa ignored them. She had survived far worse than whispers, and she understood something they did not. Indifference was a choice, but so was care. On the third evening, when Adrian passed her in the hallway and gave her a glance that lingered a second too long, she felt the unspoken warning in his eyes. He did not want interference, did not want anyone piercing the fragile order he had built, but Clarissa only bowed her head and continued on. She knew her place in the hierarchy of the house, but she also knew the bond forming between her and Daniel mattered more than rules. She did not yet realize that soon the boy's life would hang in the balance, and that bond would drive her to break every barrier this mansion had built. On that gray morning, the clouds hung low, pressing against the hills in a way that made the house feel smaller, darker, heavier. And while other maids focused on polishing the marble floors and preparing for a future dinner Adrian had scheduled with investors, Clarissa found herself hesitating again at Daniel's door. She knocked twice. No answer. She opened the door slowly and froze. Daniel was lying half off his bed, his body drenched in sweat, his small frame trembling violently as if every muscle were at war. His lips were cracked and dry, his breathing shallow and ragged, like glass scraping against itself. The room smelled sharp, a mix of plastic, medicine, and something more sinister: fear. Clarissa dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed them to his forehead. He was burning, his skin slick and gray beneath the flush of fever. She looked desperately around the room and spotted the emergency call button on the wall. She pressed it, but nothing happened. She darted into the hallway, sprinted toward the landline, and dialed the nurse's number listed on the record sheet. Straight to voicemail. She called again, listening to the hollow ring before slamming the receiver down in frustration. Then she dialed Adrian's number. 4 rings, 5 rings, nothing. She tried again over and over, but the line remained dead, her pleas swallowed by the static silence of distance. She pounded her fist against the desk before rushing back upstairs, her heart hammering, only to find Daniel worse, his eyes fluttering as if he were drifting out of consciousness. Panic burned in her throat, but she forced it down, forcing herself to breathe even as her pulse raced. She ran downstairs, bursting into the kitchen where the other maids were laughing over some story. "I need someone, anyone to help," she gasped, her voice frantic. "Daniel can't breathe. He needs a hospital now." One maid looked up briefly and shrugged. "We don't go upstairs without clearance." Another waved her off irritably. We'll inform the estate manager. That's the process. Clarissa stared at them in disbelief, her fists clenching, her jaw tight with anger. Process, she spat. But they had already turned back to their conversation, dismissing her words as though she were a child crying wolf. The fury that welled inside her felt volcanic, but she swallowed it, spinning on her heel and racing back upstairs. Daniel was curled tighter now, his breaths ragged, his body stiffening with every shallow inhale. Clarissa knelt beside him, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. She could not wait for clearance, could not trust the staff, could not rely on Adrian, who was continents away in some sterile boardroom. She looked toward the hallway and saw, at the far end, the locked office door, the one with sensors blinking above it like watchful eyes. She had never been inside, had never dared to, but she remembered something most others overlooked: the tiny keyhole above the doorknob and the red tag hanging beside the basement cleaning supplies marked "Do Not Remove." She remembered it because she had paused once, wondering why such a thing needed such a warning. And now the memory struck her like lightning. Without another thought, she sprinted downstairs, her feet pounding against the polished floors. She yanked the key from its hook, ignoring the bold red letters that seemed to scream at her. No one saw her, no one stopped her. The house itself seemed oblivious to her defiance until the moment she turned the key and heard the click. The door swung open, and silence greeted her like a slap. Inside was Adrian's world of leather glass and wealth. A polished desk covered in awards, framed certificates lining the walls, and in the center, a gleaming Tesla key fob and a fat black money clip stuffed with $100 bills. For a moment, Clarissa froze, her hands trembling, her conscience screaming at her to stop, to turn back, to follow the rules. But then she heard Daniel's faint whimper echoing down the hallway in her memory. Rules had not saved him. Protocol had failed him. She didn't hesitate again. She grabbed the keys, snatched the cash, and raced back upstairs. She scooped Daniel into her arms, his frail body frighteningly light, yet heavy with the responsibility of life and death. Her arms trembled under the strain, not from fear, but from the effort. But she did not stop. She carried him down the hallway, past blinking cameras and cold walls, past the invisible rules that had been designed to maintain order, but now only promised death. The mansion seemed to scream at her with every step, alarms waiting to trigger, staff waiting to condemn, but Clarissa pressed forward. She burst through the front doors into the open air, her lungs filling with the storm-soaked oxygen of freedom, and headed for the garage. The Tesla recognized the key immediately, the sleek door hissing open like an invitation. She laid Daniel across the white leather passenger seat, his chest rising and falling too quickly, his face ghostly pale. She buckled him and gently whispered, "Hold on, Daniel, just hold on," then climbed into the driver's seat. Her hands clutched the wheel with white-knuckled desperation as she pressed the accelerator. The tires squealed against the pavement, the car launching forward, away from the estate, away from the paralysis of rules, toward the fragile hope of survival. Behind her, in the mansion, alarms blared. Security screens lit up red. Unauthorized access. Office breach. Vehicle missing. Clarissa didn't look back. Her focus was fixed on the road ahead, on the life she carried beside her, on the choice she had made that would change everything. The mansion was not a home, it was a machine, and she had broken its gears. She pushed the accelerator harder, her knuckles whitening as the car surged down the hillside road, the tires squealing with each turn. She muttered prayers under her breath, fragments of words she hadn't spoken since childhood, pleading for strength, for time, for mercy. Daniel's head lolled weakly against the leather seat, his lips cracked, his breaths shallow and too fast. She reached across briefly to squeeze his hand, whispering, "I've got you, just hold on, don't give up." His tiny fingers twitched faintly in reply, the smallest sign that he still heard her, still clung to something. And that was enough to drive her forward. She ignored the GPS screen that lit up, its robotic voice suggesting routes to the nearest hospitals, because she knew better than to settle for nearest. She needed the best, the one place in the city that had a specialist wing known for treating sickle cell crises. It would take longer, and every second carved her heart with terror, but going anywhere else felt like surrender. Traffic blurred around her, horns blared, drivers shouted as she weaved between lanes. But she no longer registered the chaos. The world narrowed into a tunnel of asphalt, headlights, and the faint rise and fall of Daniel's chest. She thought of the mansion she had just fled, the cold staff who had dismissed her pleas, the blinking sensors over Adrian's locked office, the polished desk with its taunting piles of money that meant nothing in that moment except the chance to buy time. She had taken it all, because rules had not saved Daniel, money sitting still had not protected him, and obedience had nearly killed him. She would not obey again. Behind her, though she could not yet see them, the Whitmore security team was already mobilizing. 2 black SUVs peeled out of the estate's gates, engines growling, headlights cutting through the misty hills as they tracked the Tesla's location. Radios crackled inside their vehicles as orders were relayed. Retrieve the car, recover the money, secure the staff member who had breached protocol. None of them spoke of Daniel's crisis, because in their minds the breach was the true emergency, not the boy fighting for air in the front seat of a speeding car. Clarissa didn't know how long she had before they caught up, but she refused to slow. She clutched the wheel tighter. Her body hunched forward as though sheer willpower could drag them faster toward salvation. The hospital came into view at last, its white facade glowing under fluorescent lights, the red emergency sign like a beacon. She slammed the brakes, the Tesla screeching as it slid into the emergency lane. Her heart hammered as she flung open the driver's door and sprinted around to unbuckle Daniel. She gathered him into her arms, his weight frighteningly insubstantial, and staggered toward the sliding glass doors. "Help!" she shouted, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Please, someone, he can't breathe, he has sickle cell." The words tumbled out, raw and frantic. Nurses rushed forward immediately, wheeling a gurney, shouting for a crash cart, their urgency slicing through the sterile air. Clarissa laid Daniel down as gently as if he were glass, her arms trembling from both exhaustion and fear, and then she stumbled back, watching as doctors swarmed him, attaching monitors, inserting IVs, working with practiced precision. "Parent or guardian?" someone demanded without looking up. Clarissa's throat tightened. "I'm the maid," she said, the words sounding almost absurd in the blinding white lobby. "I'm the maid." There was no one else. The staff did not press further, did not demand proof. They only pushed Daniel down the corridor, their voices sharp with medical orders. Clarissa stood frozen in the center of the lobby, her breath ragged, her hands shaking, the weight of what she had done pressing down on her. She was not supposed to be here. She was not supposed to drive. She was not supposed to take money. She was not supposed to matter. But none of those rules had mattered when Daniel lay gasping on the floor of his room. Now the enormity of it all threatened to crush her. The world seemed too bright, too loud, until the sudden screech of tires outside jolted her back to reality. Through the glass doors she saw them. 2 black SUVs pulling up in perfect synchronization. Security poured out, men in matching navy jackets, radios strapped to their shoulders, eyes sharp with purpose. They didn't shout or ask questions. They didn't need to. One simply pointed at her, and that was enough. "That's her." Clarissa felt her pulse spike, but she did not run. She did not flinch. She turned slowly to face them, her chin lifted in quiet defiance, her wrists already pulled behind her before she even resisted. The cold steel of handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists, biting into her skin as though punishing her for saving a life. A nurse hurried forward, outrage in her voice. "What are you doing?" She brought in a patient in crisis. One of the guards replied with chilling detachment. "She stole a millionaire's car and cash. She's under arrest." Clarissa's jaw tightened, her breath shallow but steady. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to beg, refusing to explain. For that she was now surrounded by state security, their uniforms sharp, their expression stony, their voices clipped with the authority of men who cared only for rules, not reasons. One of them gripped her elbow tightly, forcing her toward the glass doors, while another spoke into his radio, confirming her detainment. To them she was nothing more than a breach to be contained, a problem to be removed. Inside, She could still hear the faint urgency of doctors calling out medical terms she didn't understand, the rhythmic beeping of machines being attached to Daniel, the hurried shuffle of nurses working to keep him alive. That sound was her only anchor, the only reassurance that what she had done was not in vain. The cuffs clinked with every step, each sound reminding her that the world saw theft, not sacrifice. She did not resist as they pulled her outside into the night air, cool and sharp with the scent of impending rain. The two SUVs loomed like predators, engines idling, their black paint gleaming under street lamps. The guards didn't shout, didn't gloat, they didn't need to. Their silence was worse, a declaration that her fate was already decided. They pushed her gently but firmly against the side of one vehicle, searching her quickly, then securing her in the back seat. The door slammed shut, the heavy thud echoing like a verdict. Through the tinted glass, she could still see the glowing hospital sign, the revolving doors where she had just cried out for help, and she whispered to herself, "Please hold on, Daniel, just hold on." As the SUV pulled forward, her mind replayed the frantic drive, the screech of tires, the blur of headlights as she had threaded the car through traffic with nothing but instinct and terror to guide her. She remembered gripping the wheel so tightly her palms burned, remembered praying out loud for strength, remembered the way Daniel's tiny hand had twitched in hers. Behind them, horns had blared, people had shouted, but none of it mattered. Her world had narrowed to the boy gasping for air beside her and the hope that she could reach the hospital in time. She thought of the other staff back at the mansion, still polishing floors and ironing linens, oblivious or uncaring about the child upstairs who might have died if not for her. Their loyalty to process had nearly killed him, and for that Clarissa knew she could never forgive them. The car hummed around her now, the guard in the passenger seat tapping at a tablet, confirming her information. "Clarissa Jones," he muttered. "New hire. Breached the office. Took the Tesla. Took cash. Unauthorized exit." The driver grunted. "Protocol violation. This will be reported directly to Mr. Whitmore." Clarissa closed her eyes, pressing her head back against the seat. She knew Adrian would be furious, would see only the theft, not the reason behind it. But part of her also knew that eventually someone would have to tell him the truth. His son had survived because of her. The thought gave her the faintest ember of strength. The SUV slowed as it circled the hospital grounds, idling near a secured entrance where local police were expected to arrive. Clarissa's heart sank. Arrest meant records, charges, possibly prison, all because she had acted when no one else would. She clenched her fists against the cuffs, her nails biting into her palms, but she refused to cry. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Suddenly, the rear doors of the hospital burst open, and Adrian Whitmore himself strode into the night. His tailored gray suit looked out of place in the sterile chaos, his expression cold, unreadable. He moved with the calm authority of a man used to owning every room he entered, even here, even now. The head of security stepped forward immediately. "Sir, she's secured. Local PD is on the way. Vehicle recovered, cash being counted." Adrian's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking briefly toward the SUV where Clarissa Saturday and my son, he asked, his voice low, sharp. The guard hesitated. "They're stabilizing him. Barely got him in time." The words hung heavy in the air, but Adrian did not react beyond the faintest twitch in his jaw. He turned back toward the hospital entrance, hands slipping into his pockets, his face a mask of control. Clarissa watched him through the tinted window, her chest tightening with a mixture of anger and sorrow. Here was the man with all the money, all the power, who had left his son alone to collapse, unreachable behind walls of security and silence. He didn't even look at her, didn't acknowledge that she had been the one to act, the one to carry Daniel through those sliding doors. To him, she was nothing but an inconvenience, a thief. Yet somewhere inside, she clung to the memory of the doctor's words she had overheard before being dragged away. If that young woman hadn't gotten him here when she did, he would have died. She repeated it silently over and over, as the guards adjusted their radios and the engines rumbled softly, as though trying to drown out the truth. She didn't know what Adrian would do next, didn't know if he would press charges or bury the story, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had saved Daniel's life, and no amount of rules or punishment could erase that. She tried to steady her breathing, telling herself that no matter what happened to her, at least Daniel was inside, alive, treated, given a chance. Yet even as she clung to that thought, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal pressed hard against her chest. The guards outside spoke in clipped tones, confirming her capture, their radios buzzing with static as they awaited further orders. To them, she was not a rescuer, not the one who had broken the paralysis of the mansion's routines, but a thief who had crossed lines she was never meant to cross. They had no interest in her explanations, no patience for the truth. She could feel the weight of their judgment as heavily as the cuffs on her wrists. Then the headlights cut across the parking lot, and another sleek black sedan slid to a stop, its door opening to reveal Adrian Whitmore himself. He stepped into the night in his tailored gray suit, sleeves rolled up from his flight, his tie missing, his expression cold and sharp, like a man still tethered to the boardroom. His presence was commanding, but his eyes betrayed nothing of urgency. No panic at the thought of his son inside fighting for breath. He looked at Clarissa only once briefly, as if she were a problem to be solved, before turning to the head of security. "Report," he said flatly. "Sir, she's secured," the guard replied. "Local PD, en route. Vehicle recovered. Cash accounted for. We're holding her here until police take custody." Adrian's jaw tightened. "And my son?" he asked, his voice quieter, more dangerous. The guard shifted slightly. "Doctors say they're stabilizing him. Barely got him in time." For the first time, Adrian blinked, the words sinking into the iron facade of his composure. The phrase hung in the air like a judgment. Barely got him in time. He said nothing in response, only turned his gaze toward the hospital entrance, where fluorescent lights spilled out onto the pavement, his hands sliding into his pockets, as though hiding his own unease. At that moment, a doctor emerged through the doors, his white coat streaked with the chaos of the emergency room, his face set in stern lines. He approached Adrian without hesitation. "Mr. Whitmore?" Adrian nodded. The doctor exhaled sharply, his tone clipped but controlled. "Your son has sickle cell disease. When a crisis hits, every minute matters. Seconds matter. If that young woman hadn't gotten him here when she did," he stopped, his eyes boring into Adrian's, "he would have died." The word "died" echoed into the night air with a finality that seemed to cut through every layer of the mansion's protocols, every ounce of Adrian's defenses. Clarissa, still locked in the SUV, caught the words through the cracked window, her chest tightening as though she were hearing them for the first time. She watched Adrian, saw him freeze, saw the cold mask falter, if only for a second. The doctor did not wait for his reply. "Your phones were off. Your staff were unreachable. Your security protocol was too slow. That girl saved him. Not you. Not your systems. Her." Then he turned on his heel and walked back inside, leaving the weight of his words behind. Silence fell heavy over the parking lot, broken only by the hum of the SUV's engine and the faint buzz of radios. Adrian remained still, his eyes lower to the asphalt, his jaw clenched tight. For the first time, perhaps in years, he looked less like a man in control and more like a father who had failed. The guards glanced at one another, uncertain, but none dared to speak. In the back of the SUV, Clarissa kept her gaze fixed forward, refusing to let the tears pressing at her eyes fall. She would not cry here, not like this, not while they treated her as if she had endangered rather than saved. The minutes stretched long until finally Adrian moved. He stepped toward the SUV, his polished shoes silent against the concrete, and opened the back door himself. Clarissa turned her head slowly to meet his eyes. For the first time since she had been hired, he really looked at her. Not past her, not through her, but at her, as though only now seeing that she was flesh and blood, that she had stood where he had not, acted when he had failed. Her eyes were red from exhaustion, but steady. She did not flinch. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Adrian reached into his pocket, pulled out a small silver key, and unlocked her cuffs. The steel fell away, clattering against the seat. No words were offered, no apology, no thanks, only a quiet order. "Come with me." Clarissa stared at him, hesitant, until he added, "He's asking for you." The words stole her breath. She stepped out of the SUV slowly, her legs weak from the adrenaline still coursing through her body, and followed Adrian toward the hospital entrance. The guards did not stop her, though their eyes followed her every step. Inside, the hallway was eerily quiet after the chaos, the kind of silence that felt fragile, suspended between despair and relief. Room 214 waited at the end. Adrian paused outside, his hand hovering near the frame, as though he weren't sure he deserved to enter. For a man who owned so much, who commanded armies of employees and dictated the flow of millions of dollars with a word, that hesitation revealed the truth. In this room, with his son fighting to recover, his power meant nothing. He stepped aside, letting Clarissa enter first. Daniel lay under thin hospital blankets, a small figure against the expanse of white sheets, his skin pale but his breathing steadier than when she had carried him in. His eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment his gaze drifted until it landed on her. His lips parted, and in the faintest whisper he breathed her name, Clarissa. That single word was not a plea, not an accusation, but recognition. His voice, weak as it was, carried gratitude that no one else had offered her. Clarissa moved to his side immediately, kneeling so her eyes were level with his. She took his frail hand gently, careful not to squeeze too hard, and whispered back, "I'm here." Behind her, Adrian remained still, his tall frame rigid as he stood in the corner of the room, his eyes locked on the two of them. He watched as Daniel's fingers curled weakly around Clarissa's, watched as a faint light flickered in his son's eyes that had not been there for months. He felt like an intruder in his own child life, and the realization stung deeper than any boardroom defeat. The room stayed quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors and the slow drip of N4. Clarissa kept her focus on Daniel, brushing strands of damp hair from his forehead, whispering encouragements that only he could hear. To Adrian, it was a scene that both shamed and humbled him. The maid he had dismissed as invisible was the only person his son wanted, the only one who had acted when it mattered. His mind replayed the doctor's accusations. "Not you, not your systems, her." Those words struck him like a hammer against stone, chipping away at the facade he had built for years. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge what he had denied. Money could build walls, hire staff, and create the illusion of security, but it could not substitute for compassion, for the simple act of showing up. He had failed in that, and Clarissa, the woman he had barely noticed, had stepped into the void without hesitation. Later, when Daniel finally drifted into a fragile sleep, Clarissa eased her hand away gently and stood, turning to find Adrian still watching her. Their eyes met, and in that long moment words were unnecessary. But silence could no longer suffice either. Adrian finally spoke, his voice low, rougher than usual. The doctor said he would have died. Clarissa nodded slowly, her expression steady. "Yes." He inhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "And you broke into my office. You took my car. You stole my money." She held his gaze without flinching. "I did." Her voice was calm, unashamed. "Because no one else would help him. Because he needed me." The words hung between them, simple yet undeniable. Adrian's chest rose and fell as he tried to reconcile the truth. He wanted to condemn her for defying his authority, for breaking the order of his world. Yet every instinct told him that doing so would make him the villain not only in her eyes, but in his son's as well. Daniel had asked for her, not him. Daniel had spoken her name, not his. That realization pierced him deeper than any accusation could. He finally lowered his gaze, his voice softer than before. "You saved his life." Clarissa did not answer. She didn't need to. The truth was already clear. Adrian exhaled slowly, turning toward the window where the city lights blinked in the distance. He felt the weight of years pressing on his shoulders, years spent burying himself in work, in wealth, in systems designed to protect what mattered, while slowly losing sight of what truly did. He had thought himself untouchable, insulated by rules and order. But tonight those very systems had nearly killed his son. The only reason Daniel still breathed was because of the woman behind him, the maid whose name he had never bothered to learn until today. He turned back toward her, his voice firm now, though tinged with something new: respect. Stay with him. He needs you." Clarissa, inside the room, sat quietly by Daniel's side, her hand resting lightly on his, whispering to him whenever his breathing faltered or his eyelids fluttered open in fear. She had no title, no wealth, no authority, yet she held the one thing Adrian could not buy: trust. Daniel trusted her because she had shown up when no one else had, because she had lifted him into her arms when others refused, because she had broken the rules that Adrian himself had created. Outside the room, Adrian leaned against the wall, staring at the floor tiles as though they could give him answers. His mind replayed the doctor's damning words: "Not you, not your systems, her." He wanted to be angry at Clarissa for defying his authority, but anger crumbled under the weight of truth. He had been unreachable, buried in meetings across an ocean, his phone off, his staff bound by processes that valued obedience over urgency. His systems had been perfect on paper, but they had failed where it mattered most. And now the evidence was undeniable. His son had survived only because a maid had chosen compassion over fear. Minutes stretched into an hour, the sounds of the hospital muffled but constant. Voices paging doctors, stretchers squeaking across linoleum, the steady beep of machines monitoring fragile lives. Adrian stood there, shoulders tense, before finally returning to the room. Clarissa looked up at him briefly, her eyes cautious, but she did not move from her place beside Daniel. Adrian walked closer, stopping at the foot of the bed. Daniel's breathing had steadied, though his small face still looked drained. His fingers still curled weakly around Clarissa's hand. Adrian swallowed hard, words catching in his throat. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "Thank you," he said. Just 2 words, but for a man like him, they carried more weight than entire speeches. Clarissa's gaze held his, searching for mockery or insincerity, but there was none. She nodded once, her voice steady though soft. He needed someone. Adrian exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, his composure cracking further. He stepped back and sank into the chair on the opposite side of the bed. His first true act of presence in his son's life in longer than he could remember. For a while the room settled into a fragile peace. Daniel sleeping, Clarissa humming softly, Adrian sitting silent but present. Outside the hospital, however, the story was spreading. Reporters had caught wind of the alarms at the Whitmore estate, whispers of a maid stealing a Tesla and bundles of cash, rumors of a possible kidnapping. Headlines online screamed with speculation: billionaires maid arrested, car theft at the Whitmore estate, kidnap attempt or heroic act. None of the articles knew the truth, only fragments of gossip pieced together by staff too eager to whisper. By morning, the narrative was spiraling beyond anyone's control, painting Clarissa as a criminal and Adrian as a victim of betrayal. Clarissa, still seated at Daniel's side, knew nothing of the headlines. Her focus was the boy whose hand she held, the boy who had whispered her name in the darkness. But Adrian knew. His phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications, his staff texting updates, lawyers preparing statements, PR teams drafting denials. He read the words, saw how the world was already judging the woman who had saved his son, and for the first time in his career, he refused to listen to them. He closed the phone and looked at Clarissa, then at Daniel, and understood that the truth was bigger than his reputation. That evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, painting the hospital windows in soft gold, Adrian made a decision that surprised even himself. He called his office and ordered a press conference at the estate, live, with no statements drafted, no lawyers whispering at his side. His staff protested, urging him to control the narrative, but Adrian ignored them. For the first time, control wasn't the goal. The truth was. Clarissa learned of it only hours later, when Adrian approached her in the room. "There's something I need you to do," he said. She raised an eyebrow, wary, but he continued. "Stand with me tonight." Her breath caught. "Stand with you." He nodded. "The world is already talking. They're saying you kidnapped him, that you stole because you wanted money. They don't know what you did, what it cost you. I won't let them destroy you for saving my son." Clarissa stared at him, unsure whether to believe this sudden change, but the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. She had seen the cracks in his armor now, the guilt weighing on him, the humility forcing its way through. He was no longer speaking as the billionaire who commanded armies of staff, but as a father who had nearly lost everything. Hours later, as cameras lined the lawn of the Whitmore estate and reporters jostled for space, the gates opened and Adrian stepped out, not in his usual polished perfection, but in an open-collared shirt, no tie, his sleeves rolled up. Beside him, Clarissa walked nervously, dressed in a modest gray dress someone had pressed for her shoulders square, but her hands trembling. She looked nothing like the villain the headlines had painted her as. Adrian stepped up to the podium, the hum of cameras clicking like a swarm of bees. He took a deep breath, glanced once at Clarissa, and then spoke with a clarity that silenced the crowd. "Last night my son nearly died, and the only reason he is alive today is because of the woman standing beside me." The reporters leaned forward, their pens stilled. Adrian continued, his voice steady. "She broke rules, yes, but sometimes rules are the problem. No one else acted. No one else ran. No one else cared the way she did. Clarissa Jones did what I could not, and the world should know her name." Clarissa froze, her heart pounding as the words washed over her. Now, as the gates creaked open and Adrian Whitmore stepped forward with Clarissa Jones at his side, the atmosphere shifted from idle speculation to stunned silence. He did not stand flanked by lawyers or surrounded by assistants. There was no teleprompter, no carefully crafted statement polished by public relations experts. Instead, Adrian stood bare in his rolled sleeves, his collar open, his expression solemn. And for the first time in his career, his words were not directed toward investors or board members, but toward the public, toward a world ready to judge him and the maid beside him. Clarissa's presence was almost ghost-like at first. She wore a plain gray dress chosen hastily by someone in the household who realized she could not face cameras in a uniform. Her hair was pulled back, her shoulders stiff, and though she trembled slightly under the glare of lights, her chin was raised as though she had found a fragile strength in the storm. She looked nothing like the villain plastered across online headlines. Instead, she looked exactly as she was, a woman who had acted when others had not, who had carried a child through danger without asking permission, who had risked her future for a boy she had known only a few days. Adrian cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the hush of the crowd. "Last night my son nearly died," he began, his words stark, unadorned. "And the only reason he is alive today is because of the woman standing beside me." The statement cracked through the silence like thunder. Reporters exchanged startled glances, camera shutters clattered faster, and whispers rippled across the crowd. Adrian pressed on, his tone steady. "She broke rules, yes. But sometimes rules are the problem. No one else acted. No one else ran. No one else cared the way she did. Clarissa Jones did what I could not, and the world should know her name." Clarissa felt her knees weaken, her breath catch in her throat. She had braced herself for condemnation, for arrest, for a lifetime branded as the maid who stole. She had never expected vindication. The crowd of reporters erupted with questions, their voices overlapping in a chaotic wave, but Adrian held up a hand, silencing them. "Effective immediately," he continued, his voice firmer now. "Clarissa Jones will not only remain in my household, she will never work as a maid again. I have established a trust in her name, and she will oversee our family's medical outreach foundation going forward." The words landed like a shockwave. Clarissa's eyes widened, her mind reeling. She had expected nothing, perhaps forgiveness at most, but now he was offering her a future she could never have imagined. A murmur spread through the crowd, disbelief mixing with awe. Reporters shouted questions, flashes strobing against the dark sky, but Adrian was not finished. "If we are to build systems that protect children like my son," he declared, "they must be led by people who act, not just speak. Last night, a boy survived because someone refused to wait for permission. That is the kind of leadership this world needs." He stepped back then, gesturing toward Clarissa. For a moment she stood frozen, the cameras pressing against her like waves, the weight of attention nearly suffocating. But then she lifted her head, meeting the blinding lights, and realized she was no longer invisible. She was no longer the maid who scrubbed silently in the corners of the mansion, dismissed and forgotten. She was the woman who had saved a life. Inside the estate that night, whispers traveled quickly through the halls where staff gathered in clusters, straining to hear the press conference streaming live. "She's staying," one muttered, disbelief thick in his voice. "More than staying," another replied. "She's running things now." Clarissa passed them later as she walked back inside, her steps careful but steady, and for the first time she smiled, not out of triumph, not out of spite, but out of relief. She no longer had to walk on eggshells. She no longer had to shrink herself into invisibility. The ground beneath her feet finally felt like her own. Daniel's recovery was slow but steady, his laughter returning in small bursts that echoed down the mansion's once sterile halls. Each time he smiled, it was a reminder that compassion had succeeded where wealth and protocol had failed. Clarissa remained by his side, guiding him through days of fatigue and nights of pain, but now she did so openly, not as a servant, but as someone recognized and valued. Adrian, for his part, began to change as well. The guilt that had settled heavy on his chest forced him to step out of the distance he had maintained for so long. He attended medical consultations, sat by his son's bed, listened when Daniel spoke, even if it was only in fragments. And each time he looked at Clarissa, there was no longer indifference in his eyes, but respect. The press conference reverberated beyond the estate. News outlets that had painted Clarissa as a criminal now scrambled to recast her as a hero. Opinion pieces debated the meaning of Adrian's words, some praising his humility, others questioning his motives. But none could erase the image of the billionaire standing beside the maid he had once overlooked. She had saved Daniel, and Adrian had stood before the world to admit it. The whispers in the corridors were no longer about how long she would last, about how soft she looked, about how quickly the house would grind her down. Now they were about her new role, her future, her unexpected rise from obscurity to leadership. Some staff resented it, muttering in corners, but none dared dismiss her anymore. Others, quietly, even admired her, though they would never say it aloud. Clarissa moved among them with calm grace, not gloating, not seeking revenge, but walking with a steadiness that came from finally being seen. Daniel's recovery was slow but certain. Each week he grew stronger, each laugh lasting longer than the fragile cracks of before. The mansion, once a place of silence and procedure, now rang with the sound of his voice, the echo of his laughter bouncing off walls that had known only whispers. Clarissa was always near him, guiding him gently, listening when the pain returned, celebrating when it eased. Her presence became the anchor of his days, a constant reminder that someone had chosen to act when it counted. Adrian, too, was changing. At first he lingered in the background, watching with a mix of guilt and gratitude. But slowly he began to step forward. He sat by Daniel's bed more often, not with the detached gaze of a man fulfilling an obligation, but with the awkward sincerity of a father trying to rebuild something fragile. He attended consultations, asked questions, listened to answers, and for once put aside the empire that had consumed him. Each time his eyes met Clarissa's, there was acknowledgement, not only of her courage, but of his own failures. She had done what he had not, and though that truth weighed on him, it also freed him. He no longer had to pretend that money was enough, that systems could substitute for compassion. He had been forced to see that sometimes strength comes not from power, but from presence. Outside the mansion, the story of Clarissa Jones continued to ripple. Articles once branding her a thief now praised her as a hero, a woman who had risked everything for a child who wasn't her own. Opinion writers debated the symbolism, some calling it a tale of race and class, others of morality and courage. But none could erase the image of Adrian Whitmore standing beside her at the podium, declaring to the world that she had done what he could not. For Clarissa, the attention was overwhelming, almost unbearable, yet she learned to carry it the way she had carried Daniel in her arms, with determination, with humility, with a quiet understanding that sometimes the heaviest burdens are also the most meaningful. She did not let the world's praise distract her from the truth she had always known. She had not acted to be a hero. She had acted because Daniel had needed her, and in that moment nothing else had mattered. That was the lesson she carried into her new role overseeing the Whitmore family's Medical Outreach Foundation. She approached it not with the arrogance of someone handed power, but with the humility of someone who knew what it meant to feel powerless. She insisted that the programs focus on children like Daniel, children trapped in systems that too often delayed help until it was too late. She argued that rules should never matter more than lives, and because she spoke with the authority of someone who had lived it, people listened. The foundation grew, and with it so did her influence, but she never forgot the girl who had once been handed a mop and told not to ask questions. Each time she walked into the grand office now hers to use, she remembered the night she had broken into Adrian's private sanctuary, trembling as she grabbed the keys and the cash. The irony never escaped her. The very act that had branded her a thief was the same act that had transformed her into a leader. Daniel, meanwhile, continued to thrive. His laughter returned in full, his steps grew stronger, and though his illness never disappeared, his spirit no longer flickered like a dying flame. He had a father who finally looked at him, a home that finally echoed with care, and a woman who had proven to him that he mattered. Each time he whispered her name, it carried less desperation and more affection, the bond between them unbreakable. And Adrian, humbled by the ordeal, never forgot the night the doctor's words cut him down. "Not you, not your system, sir." Those words had shaken him, but they had also set him free. He learned to admit weakness, to let go of pride, to trust someone else, to lead where he could not. In time, he even learned to thank her not with words, but with actions. Presence for his son, trust for Clarissa, respect where once there had been indifference. The Whitmore estate, once a fortress of silence and procedure, became something different. It was still grand, still guarded, still gleaming, but within its walls now lived the echoes of laughter, the murmur of compassion, the reminder that rules broken for the sake of love can build a better world than rules obeyed in fear. Clarissa walked those halls not as a servant, but as a woman who had claimed her place. Her shoulders no longer stooped under invisibility, her steps firm. They had once called her just a maid, but she had proven that sometimes the people overlooked, the people dismissed, are the ones who rise when it matters most. She had risked everything without permission, and in doing so, she had not only saved a child, but rewritten the very rules of a life she had once been told she could never escape. And in the end, that was the message that endured long after the cameras packed up, long after the headlines faded. Real heroes are not the ones who wait for orders, who follow the script, who cling to safety. Real heroes are the ones who act when no one else will, who choose compassion over obedience, who dare to see a life worth saving even when the world tells them to look away. Clarissa Jones had once been invisible. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I'd love to hear what you think about the plot. Was Clarissa right to break every rule to save Daniel, or should she have stayed within the system? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Your voice helps keep these stories alive.